It had taken Enron 16 years to go from about 10 billion of assets to 65 billion of assets. It took them 24 days to go bankrupt.
Committee will come to order. This is a case of America's largest corporate bankruptcy. The question here is what happened, who was responsible for it happening, and what can we do to prevent this sort of thing from happening again?
So many of them were blinded by the money that they didn't see that they were sinking their own lifeboat.
It just got hungrier and hungrier. Sooner or later, they were doomed to go off that cliff at 90 miles an hour.
You'd say to yourself, why would you make a loan to people you don't think are going to pay it back? Because you're going to be on the hook. Well, guess what? The banks weren't on the hook. They would actually make the loan, and then they'd go find 20 other people on the other side of the planet in some cases, and they'd chop the loan up and hand it around, and so they had no incentive. They didn't care anymore about whether you were good for the money or not, so long as you could sign on the dotted line so that they could collect the fee.
Of very human traits, from greed to pride, ego, ambition.
They may have business cards that call themselves CEOs, or they may have $1 billion in the bank account, but ultimately they're making decisions in the same way that you and I are. It just has an impact that's so much bigger than we could ever expect.
On culture and leadership. We are absolutely delighted that you have decided to share the morning with us, and I know because this is the second of the conferences, we had Melbourne last week, that you're in for some great speakers this morning, so thank you for coming. Human Synergistics, our mission is changing the world one organisation at a time. Some people have told me it sounds slightly corny. To me it sounds very important. We know, and we'll share some of that research with you as the morning flows, that there is a very, very strong correlation between what we call constructive styles, be it personal behaviour, impact of leaders, organisational culture, and the effectiveness of those organisations over time, and for that matter, the effectiveness of economies over time, which is why we've structured the speaker sessions for you this morning the way that we have. Now, it's a very big mission. We developed this mission statement in 2004 based on some global research. And to change the world, you need a lot of people to do that. We cannot do it on our own. And a very important part of our business model is accredited practitioners, either consultants or internal folks who have learned how to use our tools and apply what we're going to talk about this morning to help transform their clients and their organisations. So again, I know it's slightly corny, but I'd like you, if you are an accredited practitioner, to please stand up now. Thank you. Take a look at those people if you're sitting near them, because if you don't know what our stuff is all about, and we do, you can sit down now, thank you. We do present what we call some circumplexes with the data in it. If it's not overly meaningful for you, then grab that person at morning tea and say, what the hell does all that stuff mean? Okay? We will try and explain it in such a way, but obviously we're not going to go into any detail around that. So the theme for this year's conference, we have long talked about the relationship between short versus long-term decision making and its impact on organisational culture. We know, and we'll show you some data around that the more an organisation focuses on the short term, the more likely it is to have what we call an aggressive defensive culture, a driving, pushing, demanding kind of culture. And although it might work in the short term, it does not work in the long term. Thus the notion of sustainability. You might get results good this year, but it's going to cost you in a year or two's time. And we know that during the GFC, when we did retests and measures on client organisational cultures through these accredited practitioners, we saw a spike in the aggressive defensive styles come up as the thinking suddenly hunkered down to the here and now rather than the longer term. So we thought we'd theme the entire conference around it this year. So just some background to that. When you look at the popular literature, if you like, around the importance and impact of thinking, one of the arguments is that one of the biggest problems is that the average tenure or length of holding amongst shareholders has declined dramatically, as that graph indicates. So we are fundamentally back to where we were pre the Great Depression. So people like me are holding shares to make money out of them, selling them when I've got a reasonable gain, turning them over. So companies tell us that we have to think short term because our investors are thinking short term. Okay, we'll think about that. Another issue that gets talked about is the average tenure of the CEO is reducing. I can remember, oh God, it would be 20 years ago, I won't name the organisation, but a very large organisation saying to me, you know, we are so dynamic, we are growing so fast that the average length of time in a managerial position in our business is 18 months. So they're in the job for 18 months and they get promoted. And they're in that job for 18 months and they get promoted. And my immediate response then was, yes, but none of them have actually been in the job long enough to see the consequences of the decisions that they've made. So you actually don't know whether they're any good at making decisions. Right? Just think about that. So, I mean, America is getting quite nervous about that, but the Australians would say, don't worry, mate, because we've been down there for years. Right? So when I'm confronted with this kind of stuff, my default position is let's look at the research. There's a very, very good study done by Harvard Business School, quoted here, that used a measure of short long-termism amongst a very large number of organisations and then looked at their investor activity and came up with these results. So the more short-term oriented organisations actually attracted short-term investors. So it's not just one-way traffic. They had greater stock volatility over that period of time, higher cost of getting capital, and actually lower profitability. So, I mean, this is a very good research study, published peer-reviewed, so you want to sit up and listen to this kind of stuff rather than what you might see in the way of graphs and assumptions and opinions around those graphs. So what this is basically saying is beware of saying it's because of what's going on outside you. It may well have everything to do with what's going on inside you. And we know in Australia, I mean, it's important enough even that the Australian Institute of Directors issued a thought leadership paper quite recently that looked at the consequences of short-term thinking for organisations. So I don't need to read those, you can see the bullet points there. And at the broader economic and societal level, the consequences of short-term thinking. So maybe we want to think about this. So the question that needs to be asked is, so why is a company like ours that is involved in leadership and organisational culture and organisational behaviour and all that kind of stuff interested in this? What the hell's it got to do with us? So what we see every day, the first piece of information around our data, is we see aggressive, defensive organisational cultures that are being driven by short-term thinking. So the easiest way to create an aggressive culture is to drive things with quarterly results, 6-monthly results, and even annual results. And what organisations need to learn, that those are indicators of what we did a while ago. They're not indicators of what we're doing now. Indicators of what we're doing now will be reflected in perhaps next year's revenue, profitability, whatever it might be. And we know that these aggressive defensive organisations are more likely to experience earnings and profit volatility over time. I mean, we've been there, done that. And on the other hand, constructive cultures will see profit growth over time. And so over a 7-year study we did in Canada, for instance, the constructive organisations showed a consistent growth and profitability over a 7-year period. The aggressive defensive, the volatility stuff. And a little bit of detail, it's not in there for those that know our stuff, the passive defensive showed this, right, unsurprisingly. We also know at the economic level that the more a country has organisations with constructive cultures, the more likely it is to be rated high on the IMD Global Competitiveness, World Competitiveness ranking. And this is what led to our mission statement, because it was in the time of early 2000s when we were opening offices in Eastern Europe, and we really believed that if we could help companies in those countries become more constructive, then we could actually help those economies grow. So we know this. And this is an issue for Australia. I mean, Australia has shifted out of the top 20 on the World Economic Forum for global competitiveness, and on the IMD global competitiveness ranking has slipped down to 16. So whilst Tim Harcourt, our economist speaker this morning, will talk about the relative strength of the Australian economy, we need to think about some other things that we might not be thinking about. And we do know that the more an organisation focuses on medium-longer term strategy, medium-longer term thinking, then the more constructive their culture is going to be. Okay? So this is the proposition for you this morning. Quite simple. So what's it look like in Australia and New Zealand at the moment? We include both countries because many of these clients run trans-Tasman businesses. This is the ideal. If you're not familiar with our stuff, we do culture surveys. And so it's a survey that goes out to the people in the organisation, etc., etc. We get generally something like the top executive group to say what culture will best help you achieve your objectives. It's not what's nice to have or a fun place to work, it's what will best help your organisation achieve its objectives. So something like, 28,000 senior executives over the years have said, we want a very constructive culture. Now I'm just going to step to one side momentarily. In your bag that you were given walking in, if you're unfamiliar with our Circumplex, there are two cards, one relating to the leadership side of life and one relating to the organisational culture side of life. And these have this round thing with 12 domains in it with a brief description. You also have the research results book, which is all of our tools, and there are a number of tools that we provide, with the Australian data, our Australian and New Zealand data in it. So what does the leadership stuff look like? What was the leadership style stuff look like? What was the leadership impact stuff look like? What does the managerial skill stuff look like? What does the organisational culture stuff look like, etc. And we give out awards to organisations, and you'll see some of that later, who have actually transformed their culture. So we have the awards book in there, and there's a little flyer for a book by Dr. Peter Fuda, which I will talk about later. So basically what this is saying is that these executives essentially want constructive cultures. So the blue, green, red. Blue, constructive; green, passive defensive; red, aggressive defensive. So it appears what will best help these organisations achieve their objectives is to have a constructive culture. And it's just a bullet point summary, and much more than that, but for want of a bullet point summary, that's what it looks like. So this is what the actual looks like. So this is nearly 500,000 people in Australia and New Zealand who have completed the survey. And what they are describing is our culture encourages people to use these behaviours. That's what culture is. Essentially, if you're not familiar with the concept, culture is how do I believe I am expected to behave in order to fit in, get ahead, and at times simply survive. So around here, you've got to be, you get brownie points by being critical of other people. For God's sake, don't be in the wrong place at the wrong time, avoid blame, etc. Again, I don't need to read them, you can read them. So it's a little different from the ideal, and the ideal is just that, it's ideal. And so now it's a roadmap of what do we need to do to get from there to there kind of stuff. Right? So does it matter? That's the important question that you need to ask. So here's a little bit of data for you. We took some of the data from our tools that allow us to measure short versus long-term orientation of leaders. And we're able to look at the culture that those leaders create. So what that piece of data shows you is when we rank ordered from the most long-term to the most short-term, then the most long-term effectiveness leaders create cultures that look like that left-hand profile, and the most short-term leaders create cultures that look like that right-hand profile, so you can see the difference. Significantly more constructive, significantly more passive defensive or aggressive defensive. So we now know that. So the next question is, so what? Here's the so what for you. The other measure that we have is those leaders' impact on productivity. So we can see that left-hand profile leaders create productivity at that level versus the short-term leaders creating that sort of impact. And that is a 43% difference. So this tells us that potentially shifting from a defensive to a constructive culture has the possibility of improving our productivity by something in the factor of 40-odd%. So if you think productivity is important, it might be worth thinking about. So the Circumplex, for those that don't know it, very, very briefly, the three clusters. There are very important words in here. So in the constructive style, we're talking about leaders and managers and cultures that encourage and facilitate. Important words. And so they encourage and facilitate people to strive, to accomplish goals, to work well with others. The passive defensive cluster, on the other hand, as opposed to a facilitate and encouraging, they now require people to. Very important difference in words. So I'm telling you what to do kind of stuff. So they now require people to keep out of trouble. Don't be in the wrong place at the wrong time, follow the rules, and basically just do your job and get on with it. The red, the aggressive defensive style cluster, is now where leaders and managers drive people. So it's gone from facilitate and encourage to require you to drive you. And they drive people to prove themselves, so you've got to look better than the next person and all that kind of stuff, and to look good. So basically I have to be a bright, shining light bulb in the organisation to be seen and noticed. So those are the three clusters in very short order, but you do have those cards to refer to, and of course somebody as an accredited practitioner stood up near you when I asked them to, if in doubt, go and grab that person.